this level working out for everybody? Is this comfortable? I feel comfortable. This level, is this good?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Again, thanks to Max and to Jamal here at the CAM to, again, allow me to participate in the 20HERTZ lecture series, which I'm a really big fan of. And so to be a part of it, I'm really honored, and I've seen a few of them. They're really fantastic. And thanks to them for all they do here. If you don't get to come out here too much, I highly recommend it. It's one, the bonus is it's free, and it's just a great institution. And they're always doing really cool stuff, very Houston-centric events like this. So thanks again to them. Also a quick thanks to a couple of people at U of H that helped me kind of streamline this a little bit, looked at some notes, and that kind of helped me, not just with this, but in other capacities and other things that I've been doing in academia, so it's been really helpful. And lastly, thanks to all of you guys coming out, and I think you're going to enjoy what I have here prepared. A quick note on how I want to proceed this evening. I thought about how I wanted to kind of divulge this information, and I have a lot of stuff that I wanted to get through. And I thought that probably the most beneficial way, the most advantageous way to go about it is actually to do something a little bit more scripted, which is actually something that I don't usually like to do. I usually tend to be more kind of off the cuff. I want to do something more informal, but for the subject of this evening's discussion, I figured something more scripted will allow me to get through sort of the chronology of a great person's life, and so I want to be able to get through a lot of things. So I think that's the benefit of having a script, but I will add this. I'll probably jump off the script a little bit, add some context, and sort of contextualize some of the slides, some of the music I'll be providing as well. So again, thank you all for coming out, and here we go. On late Sunday morning, April 13, 2014, I received a text message from my friend, Brett Koshkin. Brett's a former Houstonian who's now making his way as a freelance writer in New York City. It said, "Stop what you're doing and read the Ballad of Gishi and Albi article in today's New York Times." So I sat there for a second, looking at the message, slightly dumbfounded, mostly intrigued, and I worked up my response. Okay. And I did just that. And as it turns out, it ended up being one of the most thought-provoking stories I read last year. Something I've read a few times since, and I've thought about many and many times over. And it's a suitable entry point to discuss the subject of this evening's discussion, Mr. Robert Mack McCormick. Now, this is in fact a screenshot from that article in question. Again, came out last year, and I figured it'd be sort of a suitable entry point, something to see. Again, it's the Ballad of Gishi and Albi. Came out last year on the New York Times Magazine. Now, if you happen to know or know about Mack McCormick, or happen to be an avid reader of the Sunday New York Times, or just happen to be in tune with any or all things Texas music history, you may well be familiar with this story. See, it stirred equal parts criticism and equal parts praise from readers. But for everyone's clarity here tonight, I'll briefly summarize the plot points of this long-winded article. And mind you, it gets far more complex, both morally and story-wise, than what I have to offer here. But in summation, New York Times journalist Jeremiah Sullivan weaves this complex, long-form article, about 14,000 word plus article, I counted it, I should mention, about two obscure blues women, Gishi and Albi, who, prior to the article's publication, were known only to the world through a handful of their impossibly rare pre-World War II blues recordings made in the early throes of the Great Depression, 1930 and 1931, respectively. Said record in question, made for the Paramount Recording Company. So this picture is in fact one of only two known surviving copies of their 78 RPM record and the song within, Last Kind Word Blues, which I'll play here momentarily. And I don't have the original, but I have a digital copy, so I think that'll suffice. Now, throughout this piece, Sullivan kind of slowly, salaciously unravels this mystery surrounding these women, kind of bit by bit, kind of a detective story piece as it happened in real time, and all of which this story counted this kind of elite guard of hardcore blues aficionados, the so-called blues mafia, going back to at least the early 1960s. So that's about a half century plus of mystery in the making. So the article answers along the way, who were these women, where were they from, and what was their fate, among other questions. Now, it's a fascinating read, to say the least, if you haven't read it. Now, early on in the story, Sullivan reveals to his readers the much debated origins of these two women, which was none other than right here in Houston, Texas. So, a little side note, a little footnote about that. Again, there had been a lot of debate. A lot of sort of these blues aficionados were trying to figure out where these women were from, deciphering the lyrics and so forth. And it was popularly, but not conclusively believed they're in fact from the Mississippi Delta. So that kind of added to the story's intrigue and its suspense. You know, sort of broke the mystery behind, again, sort of the origins of this. It's very rare recording these old, again, these blues women. Now, to cut to the chase, Sullivan reveals his ace in the hole, as far as the sources were concerned, and the one man in the world who actually possessed this valuable information, Mack McCormick. But the moral linchpin to the narrative is as follows. Sullivan admits to illicitly lifting the information from Mack's private archives during one of his interviews. In fact, it was actually via his friend and sidekick, a young woman by the name of Caitlin Rose, who briefly worked with McCormick. And all this information stemmed from the interview Mack conducted with one of these two women, Albie Thomas, back in 1961, in her home neighborhood of Acres Homes, during one of his then routine documentary ventures into Houston's burgeoning ethnic enclaves. Later in the story, Sullivan goes as far to describe and justify his unauthorized use of Mack's interview as, quote, quasi-theft, which is an odd, if not troubling term, which effectively underlines the questionable journalistic ethics at play. So what I did is, again, I mentioned Acres Home as sort of the neighborhood in question, the interview that takes place, and that's sort of the information that kind of breaks the story. Acres Homes, if you weren't familiar with it, is northwest Houston, kind of straddling I-45 there between the Beltway 8 and 610 loops. So, after that, Sullivan uncovered this only known photo of Houston blueswoman, Albie Thomas, from her family in Houston during his investigation in Houston. Now, in her latter years, she had long since given up the blues and turned to the righteous path. She lived out her life as a gospel singer in a residential Baptist church before passing away in 1979. So this photo, and I think it might say precisely exactly when it's dated, sometime in the mid to late 1970s in her neighborhood, in her home in Acres Homes. And actually all these photos, like the picture of the 78, this, and the screenshot of the article, of course, this all stems from that Sullivan article in question. Now, I'll stop unraveling Sullivan's story and end with this point. McCormick, vis-a-vis his daughter, were upset about the article and the question of this so-called quasi-theft of the interview, and they let it be known publicly, in fact. But that's actually a different story. I'm not going to get too much into that. Now, part of this groundbreaking, interactive, documentary-style article, because this article features a lot of video, a lot of photos, and again, some really kind of in-depth interviews. It's really a fantastic piece of work. Part of it releases for the first time ever some of these rare recordings, which are milestones in the history of the blues, really in the history of American popular music. So what follows, this song, this recording, it's one of the most wonderful, brilliant, harrowing, devastating, and mesmerizing pre-war blues recordings ever made, and now known to have been made by a Houstonian who was interviewed decades later by a 30-year-old Mack McCormick. So, recorded in 1931, here's Houston Blues duet Geeshie and Albie with their Last Kind Word Blues. And I was able to find the lyrics online, and I just kind of compiled it into the slide here. So let's give this a shot.
The land
I actually originally wanted to play the whole song, but I got so much stuff to go through that I actually have to keep it moving. But if you like the song, if you want to check it out more, it's still available online, and we can talk about it afterwards. Okay, so moving on. There's Mac. Now, I mentioned this story not to harp on or to debate journalistic integrity, but as a convenient segue into my purpose here today, to discuss the life and legacy of this city's, really this country's, most underappreciated or perhaps unknown documentarian and guardian of all things folk, musical and cultural in Houston and in Texas and in the greater American South, especially as it pertains to the early 20th century, Robert Mack McCormick. And in some part, I'll squeeze in some details to how I got here, share some of my funny, enlightening interactions with Mac over the years. So Mac was actually in the womb when Elvie and Geeshie recorded that song in the spring of 1930 in rural Wisconsin. He was in fact born some few months later, on August 3rd, 1930, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This year, he celebrates his 85th birthday. At the height of his production years during the mid-20th century, he's recorded countless blues and folk musicians from Houston, East Texas, Central Texas, and beyond. He's interviewed countless musicians and taken immense field notes on America's teeming ethnic cultures. Now, most notably to many people, he's partly, if not mostly, responsible for the resurgence of Lightnin Hopkins' musical career during the 1960s and his successive appeal to a wider audience, particularly the college-based folk and blues revival movement of the Bob Dylan generation. Now, he also, quote, discovered and recorded Texas blues legend Mance Lipscomb. He re-released rare recordings from the progenitor of the Texas blues, Henry Ragtime Texas Thomas, and many other lesser-known folk singers, bluesmen, blueswomen, and so on. Now, his recent profile in the New York Times even caught the attention of rock and roll icon Jack White. Jack White reportedly contacted him shortly after the article. But reading this story wasn't actually the first time I'd ever heard of Mack McCormick. Now, that occasion stems back to some few years ago, back in early 2010, shortly before I entered my master's program. Now, just a little bit before that, I started to develop a keen interest in music history, particularly local music history, Houston specifically, Texas more generally. I started to learn more about a vibrant music culture and a music scene in the city that I actually never knew was possible. So in early 2010, when local authors Roger Wood and Andy Bradley published their fantastic book, House of Hits, which is this history of the famed local recording studio tucked away in southeast Houston, formerly dubbed Gold Star Studios, currently called Sugar Hill Studios, I picked up the book immediately. I read it immediately, and I loved it immediately. Now, in the book, Wood and Bradley discuss the genesis of Gold Star Studios and its founding honcho, Bill Quinn, who's arguably one of the first ever independent DIY record producers in Texas, if really not the entire South. So, in their detailing of Quinn's early war era and post-war era recordings, some of which include now legendary Gulf Coast recording artists such as Sam Lightnin Hopkins and Harry Schultz, among others, Wood and Bradley discussed the primordial process of Quinn's essentially hacking of the record production process during the war years. I just simply became fascinated by this endeavor. And I found that the person who knew and recounted Quinn's process, as it was noted in the book, was some local music historian by the name of Mack McCormick, and it kept coming back to that name. So I did what came naturally. I Googled his name, and I found that he was still alive. Wow. So I quickly became enamored with Quinn and with McCormick and this independent music making scene in my hometown of Houston, for which I always assumed there's nothing but oil tycoons and industrial giants who ruled over the town since the beginning of time. So now, here were some renegade record producers recording country blues, fiddle music, Appalachian music, hot jazz, and music from the urban pockets and the rural pockets and the underbelly of Houston and the greater Gulf Coast. It's fascinating stuff. So, fast forward a year later, starting to hone my chops as a writer, mainly through this cheap record blog I ran for a little while, I pitched a story to Texas Music Magazine. I want to do a biography piece on the life and career of Bill Quinn and the 70th anniversary of Sugar Hill Studios. So in the process, I interviewed a few people, including Andy Bradley and Dr. Wood, who ultimately referred back to their primary source, and all, again, kept coming back to Mack McCormick. So I, too, decided to go straight to the source. He was a living legend and someone intimately familiar with the inner workings of Quinn's operation. So I got his number, I called him, and not really having done much research on McCormick, or really that much on pre-war recording technology, that was my first mistake. So basically what happens next is McCormick berating me on the phone for not knowing enough about the subject to be worthy of his time to speak to him. "Why don't you go learn something first and don't waste my time," he said. So he listed off the countless jazz discographies, ethnic music indexes, all these music series and jazz journals, and record collector guides that were just beyond my scope. I was humiliated, defeated, and honestly kind of scared shitless of this old man who just schooled me on music history. But I knew that he knew his stuff more than anyone I'd ever encountered before, and it was really quite charming. So he parted that conversation by telling me to call him back when I knew what I was talking about. So in effect, this was my failed interview. My first conversation with the man ended miserably, and it would take years before I mustered the courage to talk to him again. So anyways, after that, I went off to grad school, casted that embarrassing incident off to my memory. Now back to last year, following graduation from master's program, and after coming back to Houston, I read that New York Times article per Brett's suggestion, and I decided I should try one more time to connect with Mack. After all, I knew a few more things now than I did then. For example, I've appreciated value as an oral historian for one thing. I'm much more knowledge on the whims of pre-war recording technology for another. But I knew it was going to be tough since I knew of the negative aftermath, which resulted from Sullivan's New York Times piece. I mean, he was publicly stated as pissed as a result. So anyways, last summer, I gathered my courage and I got old school with it. I wrote him a letter. In short, I wrote McCormick why I respected him, what I appreciate about his life's work, and how important it is that someone preserve his story, his unfinished manuscripts, and his finished manuscripts, his articles and publications, and his huge photo library, his vast archive. And trust me when I say this, I'm hardly the only person to do this. So anyways, I forgot about the letter. I went about my business, and I later got a call from McCormick. I had placed my phone number at the bottom, asking that he call if he ever wanted to chat. Now, considering his public defensiveness and his stated anger about that Times article, I was still actually able to get through to him and actually have a productive conversation, and he still grilled me. So, in the process of trying to get him to agree to an interview, fielding a question or two about his career, I actually found myself in his crosshairs. I found myself answering his questions into my life, into my intellect. So again, like the first time we spoke, he was vetting me. He's testing my knowledge. One wrong move, one wrong answer, and I'll hang up. So he asked, well, what do you know about the pre-war jazz discographies? So I was a little bit more prepared. I quickly rattled off an answer about how the first ones were published in Paris in the mid-1930s, and how I knew that he was in fact involved with some of the ones that were published in the US for the first time ever, at the end of the 1940s. So he was pleased with that answer, but he wasn't quite satisfied. And I hang in there question after question after question, and he keeps me on the phone for over 3 hours. So in between those questions, he reveals these amusing and amazing anecdotes about Houston in the early 1950s and about hobo train culture on the great transatlantic railroads in the early 20th century, and even about the intricacies of the battle of the War of Texas Independence. I mean, that subject alone, he went on for like 30 minutes. He actually knew everything about Joan Rivers' then recent death. I mean, he knew like everything. So it was readily apparent to me that the man reads a lot and he retains a lot of information. He retains this kind of razor-sharp memory of it all. And he can jump from year to decade just like that. And then he shoots me like these very tough personal questions. And this one, in fact, is something I scribbled down quickly in my notes because it made me laugh. He said, are you a feminist? You'd better be, because I don't put up with misogynists. Now, Mack's fiery questioning, it's all part of this process. It's all to make sure that he likes me enough to even spend time talking to me. Because for all he knows, had I been someone else, I could just be some hanger-on, some arrogant vulture with no understanding or interest in actually truly preserving this history. So, now this question, as funny as it seems, It embodies his personal philosophy, and it's something in him I highly admire about him. He's a progressive through and through. He's a self-declared feminist. He's a cultural historian, a blues musicologist, a writer, an archivist, an advocate for ethnic folk and ethnic music culture. These are just a few of the titles he's worn through his illustrious career in music and in folklore. And he lived the bulk of these things when it was a social taboo, during the conservative McCarthy Cold War era, during the death grip of Jim Crow, during segregation, during lynching, during an era of ill will towards blacks, Hispanics, the working class, and the women, especially in the South. He openly defied and rejected exclusion, racism, and bigotry of any type. See, these are the traits that I respect in a person. It's part of why I wanted to know more about him. And really, I just couldn't get over how he was doing all this stuff in mid-century Houston, Texas. This intrigued me. So anyways, after a few conversations, we began sort of opening a dialogue over the next few weeks. He calls me, I call him. Mack reveals some biographical information, some really fascinating and some neat stories from behind the scenes in music. So, what I want to do next is share some of this information, sort of a chronology. Most of this is public, but little of this has actually been compiled and certainly not presented before. So, what follows is really just a glimpse in the life of someone I consider to be a great person who did many great things. And I struggled with coming up with how to, again, present all these great many things that he did in his life. And I had to kind of boil it down. So this is hardly definitive, but it's certainly a glimpse, and so I'll kind of take you through it. Now, Mack spent much of his childhood scattered in different places: Texas, Ohio, Alabama, Colorado, and West Virginia. He'd seen a lot of the country by a young age. His parents, one an X-ray salesman for DuPont, which is his father, and another an X-ray technician, which was his mother, they divorced when he was 2 years old. So he had spent the better part of his latter adolescence in Upper Ohio. As a teenager, he worked at Cedar Point Park, which was this like amusement park located on on the Cedar Point Peninsula in northern Ohio. At the young age of 15, he was a gopher for the touring jazz bands that came in to record on a popular radio show nearby. So jazz legends like Buddy Rich, Stan Kenton, and other popular big band jazz and swing musicians of the war era. It was here, as a teenager, Mack developed his lifelong passion and his adoration for jazz music. He was hooked. So always inquisitive and chatty with band members, he would talk with them, ask them where to find the best, authentic jazz music. Resultantly, the answer was always the same: go to New Orleans if you want to see real jazz music. And that he did, eventually. So, shortly before his venture into New Orleans, he was actually living with his mother, who had moved down to Houston during the war years. And he's actually remained in Houston ever since. But from Houston, he hitchhiked to New Orleans, finding and listening to old jazz records, sometimes seeing it live in the clubs there, and keeping his finger on the pulse of the city, specifically in the historic African-American neighborhoods and its vibrant jazz scene. So a chance encounter with Orrin Blackstone, who was this record store owner and an early American jazz discographer, landed him his first job as Orrin's Texas editor to his jazz discographies titled Index to Jazz, which was a 4-volume jazz record index, which became one of the first ever American published jazz discographies. So Mack, in fact, had a lot to do with the latter publications. So these two up here, these are the first 2 volumes of the Index to Jazz volumes. Mack, in fact, worked on the 3rd and the 4th. And I was actually able to secure a couple copies of Index to Jazz, the original ones, but I didn't get the last one that he, in fact, I think he did a lot of work on the last volume of the 4-volume series. So anyways, the year was 1949. Mack was just 19 years old. World War II was just a few years past, and thus began this lifelong obsession with American roots music, and to a further extent, American roots culture, and this unstoppable desire to document and preserve it all from the ravages of mass, popular, homogenous culture. It was this never-ending quest for the authentic, and the wholesale rejection of the inauthentic, the crude, and the derivative mass-consumed pop music. So from Index to Jazz, which he edited, again, those last 2 volumes, and he included a lot of Texas musicians, be it jazz, sort of folk vernacular musics, blues as well. He went on after that to start working for, he became the editor for Playback magazine. Now, Playback is actually like the journal compendium to the Index to Jazz, and also published by Orrin Blackstone. So he was doing all this, again, this is 1949. I don't know if these aren't, I'm not sure, I can't verify if these are the actual ones that he worked on. Playback magazine is a fairly obscure New Orleans-based magazine, and I had to kind of search far and wide to even see a copy of it. So it indicated to me they were fairly limited, sort of small, sort of fairly limited in its distribution. But these are from 1950, so I wouldn't doubt if he had something to do with maybe with these two volumes here. Now, honing his skill for these local New Orleans-based publications, he went on to become the first ever Texas correspondent for what's arguably the most illustrious jazz magazine, jazz journal, Downbeat magazine. Now, for Downbeat, he interviewed Frank Sinatra, Louis Armstrong, among others, and he may still remain the only Texas correspondent for what is mostly a northern-based magazine. So really, I mean, in the parlance of the immediate post-war years, with few music journalists, let alone cultural writers in existence in anywhere in the South, or Texas, really, this was really quite an accomplishment. He recalled to me in a phone interview later that even still today, becoming the Texas editor for Downbeat remains one of his most shining personal achievements. And as he so simply explained to me, quote, "I just wanted to know everyone involved in recordings in Texas." So yeah, no simple feat whatsoever, but that's really the motivation that he would work on. He really wanted to know all the people involved with the recordings in Texas that he could possibly find. And this is at a time when this is certainly an impossible feat, then like yesterday. So it's at this point in the conversation when we're chatting, and as Mack is often wont to do, to remind me of things. He reminds me that Sinatra was in fact a big band leader when he had brought up earlier that he had interviewed Sinatra. That he's a big band leader, like in the style of vocal jazz and something of an early pop pioneer. But he grows frustrated at people's misunderstanding of Sinatra. And he enlightens me on this common misconception, something else I found a little amusing and something I scribbled into my notes. He boldly told me, Americans don't know shit because they think Frank Sinatra sings ballads. Now, I chose this quote not just because I think it's funny. It's a little bit funny, though. But also because it perfectly embodies McCormick's masterful knowledge on the intricacies of musical compositions and the distinctions of song types and the distinctions of song formats. I mean, to him, it's obvious that Sinatra doesn't sing ballads because he's long since understood that ballads, which emanated from the British Isles and imported into the United States, are a form of poetic verse. They're essentially a narrative sent to music, like a story song, if you will. So Sinatra sings pop, not ballads. See, these are the details that matter to McCormick. He's meticulous to the nth degree, and it's why he's excelled as documenting. His rigid work ethic dictates that ignorance, laziness, and inattention to detail are simply not tolerated. And so began McCormick's career, his venture into writing, researching, and documenting rolling into the 1950s. Not so much with a bang, but with this gradual shift, motivated by moving interest in all things roots and folk culture. The subterraneous, the non-homogeneous, the non-corporate, the non-mainstream, the ethnic cultures which exist in the city and its surrounding enclaves. It was this passion to know and to yearn for more intricate inside information about the little known and the little appreciated. These characteristics marked Mack for the rest of his life. Now, in McCormick's Houston in the 1950s, the city was certainly just a geographic fraction of its current magnitude. And yet, still, McCormick was starting to uncover French Creole blacks from Louisiana who had migrated to Houston in its historic political wars, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th especially. Now, McCormick often ventured into Frenchtown, which is a small 4-square block neighborhood in 5th Ward, which was featured 500 black families of French and Spanish descent from Louisiana who had come to northeastern Houston and organize this community in the early 1920s, many of which would work for the Southern Pacific Railroad. So I kind of delineated there the origins of Frenchtown. Again, if you can see, kind of straddling 59 there and the greater 5th Ward neighborhood, and I know we have a couple of Fifth Ward students in the house, so so I wanted to kind of put that out there, sort of a visual. Now, McCormick was one of the first to recognize the introduction of the region's most innovative and distinct vernacular folk music with its roots in Louisiana, Zydeco music. So which, if you didn't know, Zydeco is a French word for snap beans, les haricots. I could be totally butchering that. But it kind of morphed through time to Zydeco. Historian and writer Roger Wood, author of Texas Zydeco, who's in fact sitting here in the audience tonight, credited McCormick's responsibility for the current spelling of Zydeco, Z-Y-D-E-C-O. So yes, you can thank McCormick for that too. This was, I pulled this quote from his liner notes because alongside some of the recordings that he made in the 60s, the 50s and 60s, he also had these fantastic, really in-depth liner notes. And I pulled this quote because I think it kind of speaks to, again, his knowledge on the neighborhoods and the notion of sort of lineage and descent in these neighborhoods. This one as follows says, "The city of Houston is in fact less a city than it is an amalgam of villages and townships surrounding a cluster of skyscrapers. The Louisiana French-speaking people are to be found in the northeast of Houston, i.e. Frenchtown, as we saw here. The East Texas people in the northern fringe, the German and Poles in Northwest Heights, and so on. And so the city in which itself has no cultural traditions is rich in those it has acquired." He had these really prolific, long-winded, really wonderful liner notes that almost kind of serve as like anthropological study, along with just knowing the history and the lineage of the music itself. And this is a perfect example of that. Now, during the, let's see if I want to use, I'm going to go to that slide in just a second. Now, during the 1950s, when he was then in his 20s, McCormick traveled around Harris County and the surrounding regions by car, by hitchhiking, by foot, and by other means. Now, in one of our conversations, he once told me how he would just walk up and down Washington Avenue throughout the corridor. And from there, he would just, quote, find interesting people to talk to and interview them. So, for example, like a gentleman with an old filthy joke, an itinerant singer, an immigrant with a song, whoever he could find to spare him a story or a folk song. He would also ask these people about other people who made music, folk music specifically. So, for example, he would inquire while he was in these neighborhoods about such and such bluesman who was reported to be in that area, or a Cajun fiddler, a Mexican accordionist, a Czech polka player, a German singing society man, an Appalachian fiddler, and on and on. See, it was this kind of cold call method which brought him his recent notoriety in the New York Times, that infamous Albie Thomas interview, which he conducted back in 1961, through that same tactic. So it was throughout the 50s and the 60s that he would just kind of walk into these neighborhoods with camera in hand, and in some cases with recording equipment, just to record any folk musicians and try to pick up folk tales that he could. Now, he spent his spare time working enough just to pay for these hobbies and these interests of his. So, for example, he was at once a short order cook. He was a taxi driver in the 4th Ward, an electrician for an offshore barge, a census official for the U.S. Census Bureau, a writer, a playwright, an amateur photographer, a documentarian, and on and on. He even worked as a carny, apparently, in Oklahoma for a short stint. He later earned one of his most prestigious titles with a position with the Smithsonian Institute in the late 1960s. One of his jobs included a short stint as a record archivist at Houston's KXYZ radio, which was one of only 3 stations in the city at the time. So all of these jobs purpose some sort of means to an end. And he could gather some sort of information or some sort of talent from these jobs so that he could just further fulfill his hobbies and his interests and his sort of anthropological study. So, for example, the KXYZ job that he has in record archivist, he could go and he learned the science of archiving so they could then apply that to his own archive. he was a taxi driver in the Fourth Ward, primarily so they could take people to and fro to juke joints and barrel, different sort of like juke joints and live music venues, just to get to know where music was performing and where he could find new musicians. He was a Census Bureau agent just so he could knock on people's door and ask them questions about their lives. He did these things to fulfill his interests and his fascinations in people, and particularly the people that lived in the city. All these things were kind of, again, means to an end. Later, he founded the Houston Folklore Group in 1951 with famed folk singer and 60s protest icon Pete Seeger. So Mack, like other song collectors before and after him, traversed the lower Brazos River bottomlands in search of original folk ditties and blues tunes, field hollers, and border ballads, songs which encompass the Lone Star State and its diverse inhabitants. He was especially after prison songs, part of which encompassed his mission with the Houston Folklore Group. So what he did, Mack meticulously mapped out the 7 major Texas prison farms located in and around Fort Bend County, southwardly and westwardly from the Houston city limits. So what I did, reading about his exploits, I was really curious about how he would just kind of go up and down from these prison farms and go there for the purposes of documentation and recording. So what I did was I kind of followed his trajectory. So these, in fact, with the little kind of plot points there, are where Mack would go in southeast Texas. And you can see the Jester 3 unit, which is also called Central Unit, in modern-day Sugar Land in Fort Bend County. And in fact, that Jester 3 unit was formerly known as Imperial State Prison Farm of Sugar Land, which was the infamous Texas prison unit, which also housed the iconic American blues singer and folk songster Leadbelly, aka Huddy Ledbetter. So it was during his time investigating regions, all these places and all these spaces around Houston, through the thickness, through the sprawl and the outwardness of Texas, attempting to document the purest expressions of folk culture, and most certainly authentic non-electric blues, that McCormick developed a theory about how regions in the South contain these so-called culture clusters, where interconnected counties contain some of the same folkloric expressions, the same games, the same music and cultural rites. These activities were hence clustered together within reach of the county seat. So, an example of that, Central Texas, according to McCormick, was the most fascinating, diverse hotbed of activity for these cultural clusters. He had counted some 200 plus musicians, which all lived within a few county radius of each other. And he would then use this grid search tactic, which is this kind of methodical county by county search. And throughout the next 2 decades, Mack traveled some 888 counties throughout the American South, much of which was based on the former slave counties scattered throughout the American South. So he'd use these counties to mold the culture cluster theory as kind of depicted in this map. So again, reading about how he formed this idea about grid searches and about these sort of culture clusters, what he would do is he would use a map probably similar to this. I don't think that this is the one that he was using, but this indicates the former slave counties of the South, right? So you can see, of course, Fort Bend County and Brazoria County in southeast Texas and East Texas, on into Louisiana, Mississippi, obviously the darker, the more populated. And so he would use some kind of map like this to kind of form out his theories about where these culture clusters were existed. And it was this very nuanced, sort of complicated theory. And in fact, I'm sure if you heard me now speaking about it, you'd probably say, you're getting it wrong. I think, in fact, it was much more complex than that. But he had these ideas about it, and he tested this idea out year after year after year throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, traveling throughout the American South. So again, just shy of 1,000 counties all throughout the American South. And again, using those like little jobs to kind of pay for gas money. And so I figured this would be kind of a good way to sort of visualize how he went about doing that. Now, starting in 1959, Mack ventured just beyond simple interviewing and his documentation. He started his venture into record production, into writing liner notes for some of his first commercial recordings. His first production credit relaunched the career of Third Ward's most notorious bluesman, Sam Lightnin Hopkins. And through time, he became his producer, his booking agent, and something of a right-hand man. He effectively launched his second career in the 60s as the iconic Texas bluesman, who was then becoming hip with the mostly Anglo college-age folk circles. Now, this picture prominently features a 40-year-old Lightnin Hopkins right there in the middle, who was in the early throes of this kind of crossover resurgence with folk singers and college students. And this is actually with the Houston Folklore Group. And what they did, starting in 1959, the Houston Folklore Group, vis-a-vis Mack McCormick, is they would have these concerts, these public concerts, and they were called hootenannies. And so this was, the first one started in 1959, and it was called Hootenanny at the Alley. This is in 1962, and for some reason they moved away from the Alley Theater. This is 1962 at University of Houston, in fact, at Cullen Auditorium in March of 1962. Love this picture. I think it's really fantastic. So again, he's with members of the Houston Folklore Group, including Jim McConnell, Pete Rose, John A. Lomax Jr., who is in fact the grandfather of John Nova Lomax, the Houston-based writer, and Ed Badeau, his brother-in-law, and Howard Porper. So this is originally published for the Houston Post. Now, McCormick's next big move leads to the founding of one of the most prominent, well-known, and well-respected record labels dedicated to American roots music, the California-based Arhoolie Records. Now, as the story goes, McCormick met with the label founder, who was just a young German-born immigrant infatuated with rural country blues, especially that of Lightnin Hopkins. His name was Chris Stratchwitz. So Stratchwitz made his pilgrimage into the heart of the American South to find the musicians he loved and to find the music that they made. He was and remains a walking, talking encyclopedia on practically all things Texas and Southern music. So with the initial help of Mack, Stratchwitz established his iconic Arhoolie label in 1960. I was going to put a lot more about Arhoolie, but I'm going to kind of condense this section here. Now, the partnership resulting from Mack's naming of the that partnership resulted in Mack's naming of the label. So, in fact, the namesake emanates from Mack Arhoolie. And the first recording to come from that partnership for the burgeoning label was Mance Lipscomb's Texas Sharecropper and Songster. I was going to play one of the songs from this record, and I just realized, like, right when I got here that I left it. So that's one of my boo-boos. I apologize for that. But I have some Lightnin Hopkins that I'm going to play here momentarily. Now, McCormick knew of Mance through these grid searches that I was talking about earlier, scanning the depths of Central and East Texas. And Mance was like the real deal old-school country bluesman, whose musical and cultural lineage stretched back to the cotton-picking ballads and field hollers from the 19th century. So this LP and the many blues recordings which sprang from those early 1960s Arhoolie sessions kind of became the bedrock for the post-war Texas blues. So that's Mance Lipscomb. McCormick developed a long-lasting friendship with Lightnin Hopkins that, while reportedly wasn't always the smoothest relationship, was certainly rooted in McCormick's interest in exposing Lightnin's East Texas country blues style to an ever-increasing rock and pop market. So according to McCormick, authentic Texas blues relics like Hopkins needed to be recorded. Their music needed to be preserved and treasured for generations to come without the commercial adulteration of instrument amplification. He was a purist through and through. So McCormick also became his producer, his booking agent, and his spokesperson. His first LP with Lightnin was recorded in 1959, which was the first full-length long play by the Veterans Bluesmen, and it was released just some months later in early 1960. That's Autobiography and Blues, which came some years just before his resurgence into the mainstream. So what I want to do next is play a cut from Lightnin Hopkins' Country Blues, which was also one of Mack's early productions, and I'll play Rainy Day Blues from this LP. cooperate. That's weird. Well, now my turntable doesn't want to cooperate, so that's unfortunate. But, okay, what I'll do is, I think what I can do is just find an MP3 of that. I can at least play the Mance Lipscomb MP3 that I was going to play earlier, Baby Please Don't Go.
Baby, please don't go. Baby, please don't go. Baby, please don't go back to New Orleans. Your love is love. Got me way down here. Got me way down here. Got me way down here. While I'm feeling like a dog.
He is, in fact. Mance is from Central Texas. You knew that, George?
No, I just was confirming it, you know.
Yeah. Indeed. What's that? Oh, yeah. What I can do is actually go through some of the other album covers and some of the slides that I put together. Album covers are the records that he produced throughout the early 1960s.
Don't call my name. Don't you call my name. Don't call my name. Got me way down here playing all the game. Late last night, I called on you, turned down the side. Baby, please don't go. Baby, please don't go. Baby, please don't go back to New Orleans, your love.
This is another Mance Lipscomb LP cover.
He moved off of Bartley Records at that point?
Mance, yes, he did. Yeah, he did. This was with kind permission of Dr. Roger Wood. I borrowed this, in fact, from his book, Texas Zydeco. It's actually one of the few known pictures of him. There's not very many published pictures of Mack McCormick. So you saw that earlier one, which is one of the more recent ones. This is Mack with a picture of a Clifton Chenier poster. And what he's showcasing in this photo is how it says, Big Zordico Dance. If you can see that there. Big Zordico Dance. So again, before there was sort of a standardization of that spelling, basically people didn't know how to spell it, right? It was kind of this kind of vernacular expression. And so Mack is sort of demonstrating how there was, before sort of he helped kind of standardize the spelling, you would see it kind of spelled in different ways. And so that one says Zordico, which seems way off. But so again, thank you to Dr. Roger Wood for letting me use that picture. I think this is a very appropriate kind of quote from Mack McCormick. The way to do field research is always from a standpoint of ignorance. And I think that's the attitude he really took all the time when he was interviewing people and of all the vast knowledge that he created and that he was able to absorb, and all this sort of information that he found out through the years, he still sort of had this attitude in terms of what he knew and what sort of the conclusions he made. Mack was also, and I'm going to end this here, Mack was also a big, knew a lot about literature. He's very well read, and he was infatuated, in fact, with Emily Dickinson. And this is purported to be his most favorite poem, and apparently I'd read something about how he really enjoyed this poem a lot, and he would read this sometimes when he was feeling lonely. And I thought it was kind of an appropriate conclusion to the talk. It's Emily Dickinson's This Is My Letter to the World. So it says, "This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. The simple news that nature told, with tender majesty her message is committed to the hands I cannot see. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me." And anyway, so that concludes the discussion. If you have questions, and I again apologize for the technical stuff there, but yeah, so thank you very much.